Welcome back. We're talking about the upcoming referendum and the future of Crimea. Joining us from Baltimore is Job Henning, a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, a US-based think tank, and in Moscow, a geopolitical analyst and senior lecturer in international relations at Moscow State University, Mark Sleboda. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. I want to start with that diplomatic meeting that has been taking place in London between the US Secretary of State John Kerry and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. This was being billed as the last-ditch diplomatic effort to resolve this crisis, to defuse tensions over what is taking place in Crimea right now. I want you to listen to what John Kerry said right after that meeting.
The reality is that President Putin's statement that he will respect the vote offers him many options as to how he chooses to respect the vote. If the people of Crimea vote overwhelmingly, as one suspects they will, to affiliate or be associated with Russia, you can respect the vote by making sure that their autonomy is increased, that their needs that have prompted that vote are properly respected, without necessarily having to make a decision to annex.
Okay, Job Henning, let me start with you. This seems to represent some kind of a softening of the U.S. position, because whereas at one time we heard that the U.S. was not going to tolerate a referendum at all, it was not going to recognize it whatsoever, here we have John Kerry saying, well, look, we'll act once we see how President Putin responds to this referendum and the outcome of this referendum. If President Putin decides that he wants to annex Crimea, make it part of Russia, we'll have one response. If he decides that there's going to be a little bit more autonomy for Crimea, there'll be another response.
Well, no, I don't know if I'd characterize it as a softening of the position. I think it's just a realistic reflection of the fact that the U.S. has no leverage over what is going to happen at this point, and it really is all in President Putin's hands. If he wants to proceed with the referendum at this point, that's what's going to occur. I can imagine there probably continue to be other discussions out of the public eye. I certainly hope that that's happening. But the positions of the U.S. And Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other are so deeply dug in at this point that I think there's very little that would be able to prevent the referendum from occurring.
I would agree with Mr. Henning that right now the U.S. has very little leverage or control over the situation, what is happening, at least in the Crimea, at all. But I would also disagree that the choice is Mr. Putin's at this point. I would say that the choice is with the Crimean people. And opinion polls are showing that over 80% of the Crimean population is going to vote for reunification with Russia. And I should say, for full disclosure, that my wife is from the Crimea and I have family there. And I can tell you that the population is ecstatic. They were popping champagne bottles in the street at the prospect of reunification with Russia. So I think at this point it has gone too far. If President Putin tried to reverse himself now, both the Crimean people and the Russian people would react quite negatively to this, I think in an overwhelming fashion. To be led up to this point and to have created this much excitement and hope, and then to be tossed back to the chaos of this putsch regime in Kiev, seems an absolutely unlikely possibility at this point.
Right, but Mark, hasn't President Putin already reversed course? Initially, when this crisis broke out, he was saying that he really had no interest in annexing Crimea, that in reincorporating Crimea back into Russia. But that seems to have changed as tensions rose, and now you're saying that he's going to stick with that.
Well, I actually don't think that this was plan A for the Putin administration, for the Russian government all along. It's actually in Russia's geopolitical interests to keep the Crimea as part of the Ukraine, because that is a million and a half pro-Russian votes that help swing elections in the Ukraine towards a Russian ethnic and Russian-speaking East and South. Without the Crimea there, this suddenly becomes much more problematic, and the likelihood of a Ukraine orientated against Russia and to the West becomes far more likely.
Okay.
However, I think the flow of events.
Yeah, I just want to go to Job on this. And Job, you know, we've often heard this expression, be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. Is that the case here with Vladimir Putin? I mean, how does one practically reincorporate Crimea back into Russia? Most of its relationship, whether it be economic or whether it be in some respects cultural, is with Ukraine.
Well, Crimea has deep relations with Russia, and of course has for centuries. But I don't think that's the kind of the most salient element right now. With all due respect to Mark and his family and relatives in Crimea, my wife is from Tbilisi, Georgia, and I have a lot of family there. And having sovereign states being invaded to protect the interests of others in that sort of a way are just not really in the interest of anybody, both the invading party, the protected party, alleged protected party, and the sovereign nation state. In this instance, you have, and I think it's important to keep that front and center, you have the invasion of a sovereign power by Russia. I don't know that Crimea and the occupation and annexation of Crimea was in the playbook, but it's certainly an important part of the playbook. Now, I agree with Mark. There's not much Putin could really do at this point. He's locked into this position. But I think it's important to look at what else is happening. You have active Russian military exercises on the western border of Russia, the eastern border of Ukraine. You have Russia essentially talking about instability in the east, but with their activities are going to foment the sort of thing that they say they fear. So at this point, I think I should not only be on Crimea, but they should be on a longer playbook that includes a de facto veto over what happens in Kiev and the future of a viable Ukrainian state. As for Ukraine being better off without Crimea, or Russia being better off having Crimea inside Ukraine, I can't agree with that point of view. I think the wresting of Crimea from Ukraine in this violent way rips at the heart of the idea of Ukrainian identity, and Mark referring to Ukraine as the Ukraine, as if it were a province of some greater Russian nation, I think is indicative of the problem that we have here and really at the root of the crisis.
Okay, Mark, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, certainly. My family from the Crimea, and I have family throughout the east and southern Ukraine, they prefer, when using English, to use the definite article "the" to indicate their strong cultural, historical, linguistic, religious, and political connections with Russia. The Western Ukrainians don't get to define what it is to be Ukrainian for themselves. The problem with the Ukraine is there are two nations, at least two nations, existing within the borders of what is today the political state of the Ukraine. And in many ways, these are antagonistic, certainly with the far-right ultranationalism that is currently dominated in the West. And I would also like to stress that Russia has most certainly not invaded the Crimea. According to the Kharkiv Accords, treaties that were recently renewed, stretching back to the beginning of the Ukraine as a political state in '92, Russia is allowed to station 25,000 troops in the Crimea and allowed to transit them around the Crimea with the cognizant authority. In this case, the only legitimate democratically elected president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, is the only legitimate democratic authority in the entirety of the Ukraine. There is no legitimate government in Kiev with which to deal with.
Right. Job Henning, Mark Sleboda brings up a great point there. I mean, we heard that this referendum is illegal, that nobody will recognize it, that its outcome will be illegitimate, etc. What about the Ukrainian government, this interim government that's in place right now? Its leader had a meeting at the White House just a few days ago. It is not democratically elected. It is self-appointed. What kind of credibility does it have?
It's a fair point, and it's a big problem, and this is just the nature of how things unfolded. There are, of course, a lot of reasons why they unfolded as they did unfold, but the bottom line is, it is true, it's an extra constitutional change in government, and there are certainly different ways. I think the diplomatic initiatives over the last month or two could have maybe been conducted a little differently, recognizing the fact that this is a government that does not recognize or does not reflect a very divided country. That said, the way that the positions have been dug in at this point, I think, greatly exacerbate the situation. And if either side is seriously interested in a viable, unified Ukraine, the first thing that one would do would be to try to multilateralize the conversation. Don't force, or don't try to force, fruitlessly try to force the Russian Federation to talk to a government it fundamentally doesn't recognize and can't recognize, but try to move these conversations to a multilateralized level. That's been, I think, a consistent weakness in the diplomatic approach to date. Having Prime Minister Yatsenyuk visit the White House does certainly take the U.S. farther down that road. So it's a legitimate point, but there were a lot of different ways that we could have avoided the end point, or at least the event we're facing in Crimea this Sunday.
All right, and Mark, doesn't this set a bad precedent for President Putin? I mean, if he's going to say that we're going to recognize the will of the people of Crimea, is he also going to recognize the will of the people, say, in Dagestan or in Chechnya?
Well, we could also ask the question, hasn't this precedent already been set in Kosovo, or hasn't the
but that's not the question. That's not the question, Mark. But that's not the question. The question is, will President Putin recognize the interests of peoples throughout the Russian Federation, 88 nationalities?
Well, first of all, there's over 185 ethnicities within the Russian Federation. And I think the concern here is the fact that there is not a legitimate government that is capable of controlling the territory of the Ukraine at this point. At least since November, the Ukraine has been a failed state in the most basic Hobbesian sense, in that the state lost the control over the monopoly of violence when these ultranationalists and fascist mobs of the Euromaidan began taking over and killing policemen in downtown Kiev. And we've seen violence, pogroms, mob attacks, attacks on churches, political disappearances, the taking of political prisoners, complete lawlessness across much of the country right now. I think that is the special case, as well of the exacerbating factor of the U.S. and the EU having done everything to foment, fund, and support this putsch. I don't think that Russia, despite its normally principled stance when it comes to territorial integrity and sovereignty, really had any choice in this matter but to act as they did.
Okay, Job, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. We've run out of time to respond to that. Was this a putsch? Was this badly handled by the European Union in the first instance and then by the United States?
It was not a putsch. Certainly Yanukovych could have run the government very differently since being elected in 2010. He brought this crisis on himself. It's very unfortunate the way it unfolded. There was violence. There were policemen killed. That's completely true. There are different ways that the international community could be a lot more involved going up to the crisis. The offer from the European Union for an association agreement did in some ways precipitate the crisis. It was not skillful diplomacy. There's nothing we can do about that now. If Russia is truly interested in the viability of the Ukrainian government and truly interested in the violence that they say is going on inside of Ukraine that no one else seems to be able to find, then there's certainly a lot of ways that could help ameliorate that situation.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Mark Sleboda, Job Henning, thanks for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. As always, we'd love to hear from you, so please email us your questions, comments, or suggestions to theheat@cctv-america.com. And if you want to catch any of our programming online, please log on to cctv-america.com. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.